Once upon a time, in a forest, Meenu the elephant and her husband, Momu, lived a happy life. Meenu was kind and loved helping others. The couple loved their peaceful home. They spent their days walking under big trees, listening to the leaves, and splashing in the river. Their life felt perfect. All the animals saw how kind and happy they were. One evening, Meenu decided to make sweet pudding for her husband, Momu. First, she boiled some milk until it was warm and smooth. Then, she added the rice and stirred gently, letting it cook slowly until the grains turned soft. As the pudding thickened, she mixed in sugar, watching it melt and make everything sweet. For a little extra flavor, she crushed some almonds and sprinkled them on top. The lovely smell filled the air, and Meenu smiled, happy with her work. Now, the pudding was ready. Soft, sweet, and made with love. After dinner, Meenu brought out the sweet pudding, placing it in front of Momo with a smile. Meenu said softly,
"A little sweetness at the end of our lovely meal."
Momo scooped a spoonful, savoring the warm, creamy taste. Momu said,
"This is delicious, Meenu. You always make everything perfect."
They sat together and enjoyed the warm pudding. Dr. Zebu, the zebra, ran a small clinic in the forest. One morning, Mrs. Bull came with a sprained ankle, and Mr. Deer looked worried about a fever. Meenu brought some cool water to Mr. Deer, while Momu gently seated Mrs. Bull on a soft patch of grass. Dr. Zebu treated them both, and Meenu handed Mrs. Bull a sweet bunch of flowers to cheer her up.
"Don't worry, Mrs. Bull. You will be dancing soon,"
she said kindly. One day, Meenu felt strange and tired, so the couple went to Dr. Zebu's clinic. After a checkup, Dr. Zebu smiled warmly.
"Congratulations, Meenu. You are going to be a mother."
Meenu and Momu were extremely happy. Soon, the news spread across the forest, and animals gathered to celebrate. Mr. Deer, Mrs. Bull, and Meenu's best friend, Noni, showered her with kind words. Everyone was excited to meet the little one. One day, a group of hunters sneaked into the forest. They set a large net and trapped poor Momu. Despite his size, Momu couldn't escape, and the hunters dragged him away. Meenu stood frozen with fear, watching helplessly as her husband disappeared into the distance. Her heart ached, but her forest friends quickly came to comfort her. Meenu felt very sad. She cried quietly by herself. Mrs. Bull hugged Meenu, while Mr. Deer patted her gently. Meenu cried,
I don't want to live. I want to die. I can't live without Momu.
Mrs. Bull said,
Oh, Meenu. Don't say that. You are so important to us.
Dr. Zebu checked on Meenu every day, making sure she and her baby were healthy.
Don't lose hope, Meenu. Momu will be back.
Dr. Zebu said with a reassuring smile. Mrs. Noni and the others brought fruits and milk for Meenu every day. They took turns visiting her. They wanted to help her stay strong. A few months later, Meenu suddenly felt pain. Mrs. Noni and Mrs. Bull quickly took her to Dr. Zebu's clinic. Meenu was very weak, and her condition was serious. At the clinic, after a long struggle, Meenu gave birth to a baby boy. But sadly, she passed away shortly after. Dr. Zebu came out of the labor room holding an infant. He said,
I'm sorry, but Meenu did not survive. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy.
Outside the clinic, all the animals gathered. They were crying for their friend Meenu. Dr. Zebu carefully handed the baby to Mrs. Noni. She held him in her arms and kissed him gently. Mrs. Noni said,
I will adopt this child. His name is Roru.
Mrs. Bull looked at the baby with tears in her eyes, feeling the loss of Meenu. The forest was filled with sadness, but they knew Meenu's spirit would live on in little Roru. Mrs. Noni took care of baby Roru with her 3 kids. They played together every day, making him giggle and smile. Mrs. Bull would come to visit. Mr. Deer brought fresh fruits for Roru. And Dr. Zebu checked on Roru regularly. When Roru turned 1 year old, all the animals gathered to celebrate his birthday. They decorated the forest with colorful flowers and leaves, creating a beautiful party area. Mrs. Noni said,
I will bake a delicious cake for my Roru.
She prepared a delicious cake in her home, filled with fruits and nuts. The animals sang happy birthday for Roru. Mrs. Bull said,
Happy birthday, Roru. You are so loved.
When Roru turned 4, he started school and made friends with Johnny, Mrs. Foxy's child. One day, when Roru was 8, Mrs. Noni visited Mrs. Foxy's house to buy fresh vegetables. Mrs. Foxy said,
"However, Roru is not your child. But you take such good care of him."
Johnny overheard and thought,
Oh. So Roru isn't Aunt Noni's own child.
At school, Johnny said to Roru,
Aunt Noni is not your real mother. She adopted you.
Roru looked surprised and replied,
That's not true. She is my mom.
Johnny shrugged.
But that's what I heard.
Roru shook his head.
No. I don't believe that.
When Roru returned home from school, he asked his mom,
Am I your real child?
Mrs. Noni smiled gently and replied,
I raised you as my own.
Roru's eyes widened as he asked,
So, I'm adopted?
Mrs. Noni nodded and said,
Yes. Your mother was my best friend. And after her death, I adopted you. I love you so much.
One day, Roru felt angry. After getting scolded by Mrs. Noni, he shouted,
I'm not your real child. That's why you scold me. Instead of your own kids.
Mrs. Noni said,
Roru, I love you. I'm scolding you for your own good.
When Mrs. Zebu brought him fruit, he yelled,
I don't have parents. So you are giving me charity.
Mrs. Zebu's eyes filled with tears. She said,
Roru, your mother was like my sister. I care for you and love you. This is not charity.
Roru still thought that everyone only felt sympathy for him. Because his mother was gone, not that they truly loved him. At Dr. Zebu's house, Mrs. Noni gathered her friends. She sighed and said,
Roru found out I'm not his real mother. And now he is angry with me.
Mrs. Zebu added,
He even called our gifts charity.
The animals looked at each other, their faces full of concern. Dr. Zebu smiled calmly and said,
Don't worry. In time, Roru will see that. What we give isn't charity, it's love, pure and true.
One day, hunters came into the forest and trapped Roru. All the animals, including Dr. Zebu, Mrs. Bull, Mrs. Noni, Mr. Deer, and Mrs. Zebu, rushed to help. Dr. Zebu led the way. He shouted,
We can't leave him. We have to help.
Mrs. Bull charged at the hunters with all her might, her powerful voice echoing through the trees. Mr. Deer darted around, making noise to distract them. Meanwhile, Mrs. Noni and Mrs. Zebu worked together to free Roru from the trap. With brave hearts, they risked their lives, and together, they managed to escape the hunters and bring Roru back to safety. Roru looked at the animals gathered around him, feeling a bit embarrassed. He said,
Now I understand. You all love me. And it's not just sympathy. I'm sorry for how I acted before. Thank you for always being there for me.
Moral: true love is shown through care and support.